President Donald Trump has scored a major victory in the US Supreme Court. The justices have expanded his power to remove the heads of independent agencies. At the same time, they refused to immediately let him remove a Federal Reserve governor. The Supreme Court voted 6-3 to overturn the 91-year-old Humphrey's executor precedent. The 1935 ruling had protected the heads of independent agencies from being fired by the president. They could only be removed for inefficiency, neglect of duty, or wrongdoing in office. So why did this case reach the Supreme Court? Let's break it down. The case centered on Federal Trade Commission member Rebecca Slaughter, who Trump tried to fire in March 2025. The White House told Slaughter in an email that her continued service was inconsistent with the administration's priorities, offering no further explanation. Her term was originally set to run until 2029. Writing for the majority, Chief Justice John Roberts said the Constitution clearly places executive authority with the president.
All right, everyone, Dr. John here. So this is happening right now. Supreme Court expands presidential power. Executive branch now nearly unstoppable. Legal experts panic. Democrats push impeachment, not just against Trump, but his entire administration. This isn't politics. It's a constitutional earthquake. The presidency just became bigger than the Constitution itself. Sounds pretty standard, right? Presidents should be able to run their own administration. Makes sense. Except here's the problem. Critics are saying this ruling doesn't just give the president normal powers. They're saying it puts the president above the law, like actually above judicial oversight in ways we've never seen before. And then almost like clockwork, Democrats introduced this impeachment resolution. H.Res.353 sounds boring, right? Just another House resolution with a number. But this thing is absolutely loaded. We're talking 7 articles of impeachment.
This is not a close case. The FTC unquestionably exercises executive power and must therefore be controlled by the chief executive, in whom such power is vested. It follows, then, that Slaughter served as the president's subordinate at the FTC, and that the president was entitled to cut her tenure short.
Meanwhile, according to a report, Rebecca Slaughter criticized the ruling. She said it shifts too much power from Congress to the president. She also warned it could weaken the independence of several federal agencies. On the other hand, President Trump welcomed the verdict in a post on social media.
Big win just moments ago at the Supreme Court in the Slaughter case, confirming presidential power in our country to remove executive branch officers and agency appointees or representatives under Article 2. This decision was long sought by United States presidents dating all the way back to the 1930s. It is such an honor to be the sitting president who won this historic and unprecedented ruling, one of the most important ever given with respect to presidential powers.
That's not a typo. Obstruction of justice, abuse of power, corruption, and get this, tyranny. They literally use the word tyranny in an official congressional document. Can you believe this? Like we're in the modern era and we're using the same language the founders used when they were breaking away from King George. That's the level we're at right now. The timing of all this is not coincidental. The Supreme Court ruling came down recently, and the impeachment resolution was introduced earlier, but is gaining steam now because of this ruling. Democrats are arguing that this Supreme Court decision proves exactly why impeachment is necessary. They're saying the ruling shows that Trump's administration has been operating outside constitutional boundaries, and now the highest court in the land just gave them permission to keep doing it.
Slaughter wasn't the only one to be shown the door. Trump's firing spree swept through multiple agencies, and as those dismissed officials took their fights to the Supreme Court, the justices sided with the president nearly every time. But there was one exception. The court wasn't willing to touch so easily. Back in May 2025, the justices signaled that the Federal Reserve would be treated differently, setting the stage for the showdown over Lisa Cook. In a separate 5-4 ruling, the court refused to immediately let President Trump remove Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook, allowing her to remain in office while the case continues. Trump has accused the Federal Reserve Governor of misconduct linked to her mortgage applications and called for her resignation. The Supreme Court, however, said the administration had not followed due process. The justices said Cook was never given a clear explanation of the allegations or a fair chance to respond. The court said Trump can still pursue Cook's removal, but only after restarting the process and providing proper notice, evidence, and a fair chance for her to present a defense. Although the ruling did not specify what level of evidence would ultimately justify her dismissal, Lisa Cook's case continues. But the ruling does more than decide one case. It redefines the balance of power in Washington.
But before we go any further, we need to understand what this Supreme Court case was actually about, because the media is doing what they always do, making it sound super complicated and boring, so most people just tune out. But it's not that complicated, really. The case was about whether Trump's administration could fire certain federal officials without going through a bunch of legal processes. Lower courts said no, you can't just fire people willy-nilly. But the Supreme Court said actually, yeah, the president kind of can, because executive power means the president runs the executive branch. Shocking concept, right? Except 3 justices dissented. And their dissent is what's really fueling all this controversy, because they didn't just disagree with the ruling. They wrote this scathing opinion warning that the majority decision could fundamentally change the balance of power in our government. They're basically saying, congratulations, you just created an imperial presidency. So now we've got this perfect storm, a Supreme Court ruling that expands presidential power, an impeachment resolution that accuses the president of abusing that exact power. And all of this is happening as we head toward the midterms, which means every single member of Congress is thinking about how this plays with voters back home. This isn't just some inside baseball political story that only nerds care about. This is about whether we still have checks and balances in America, or whether we've officially entered a new era where the president can do pretty much whatever they want, and the courts will just shrug and say, that's executive power, baby. This is wild. Absolutely wild, because no matter which side you're on, you have to admit this is unprecedented territory we're walking into here. We're watching constitutional norms get rewritten in real time. The rules of the game are changing, and most Americans have no idea just how significant this moment really is. Think about it. The Supreme Court, the institution that's supposed to be the final check on government power, just told the president he has way more authority than we thought. And Congress, the other check on presidential power, is responding by trying to impeach not just the president, but his whole team. It's like watching the 3 branches of government go to war with each other, and we're all just sitting here with our popcorn watching it happen. Let's dig into what's actually happening here, because the surface level story is crazy enough, but when you start pulling back the layers, man, this gets even more insane. First, let's talk about this Supreme Court ruling, because most people are getting it completely wrong. The media is acting like this is some brand new radical decision that came out of nowhere, but that's not really what happened. This case has been building for months. It's part of a much bigger legal strategy that Trump's team has been working on since day 1 of his second term. When Trump came back into office, one of his first priorities was cleaning house in the federal bureaucracy. I'm not talking about normal political appointments. I'm talking about going after career federal employees, people who've been in their positions for decades. The so-called deep state that Trump and his supporters have been railing against forever. Whether you think the deep state is real or just a conspiracy theory, here's what's not debatable. Trump's administration started removing federal officials at a pace we've never seen before. A lot of these removals were challenged in court. Federal employees would get fired, they'd sue, and lower courts would often side with them, saying you can't just terminate someone without proper procedure. This was driving Trump's team absolutely nuts, because from their perspective, and honestly they have a point here, they're thinking, wait a minute, we won the election. We're the executive branch. Why do we need permission from judges to staff our own administration? So they took it to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, in a decision that surprised absolutely nobody who's been paying attention to this court's composition, sided with Trump. The ruling basically says that when it comes to executive branch personnel decisions, the president's authority is really broad. Like really, really broad. Courts can't just step in and micromanage who the president keeps or fires. Now, on its face, yeah, that makes sense. Imagine if every time a president wanted to replace a cabinet member or fire an appointee, they had to go through months of litigation. The government would grind to a halt. So there's a legitimate argument for giving the president wide latitude here. But, and this is a massive but, the dissenters on the Supreme Court are warning that this ruling goes way beyond just personnel decisions. They're saying the legal reasoning in this case could be applied to all sorts of executive actions. Essentially, if the president claims something as part of their executive authority, courts might not be able to stop it anymore, even if it's potentially illegal or unconstitutional. And that brings us to the impeachment resolution, because Democrats looked at this ruling and basically said, okay, if the courts won't check presidential power, then Congress has to. And that's exactly what impeachment is supposed to be for. It's the ultimate congressional check on the executive branch. Let's break down what's actually in this impeachment resolution, because it's pretty stunning. 7 articles. Article 1, obstruction of justice. This is claiming Trump interfered with investigations and law enforcement to protect himself and his allies. Pretty standard accusation at this point. Article 2, abuse of power. This one's about using the office for personal benefit and targeting political opponents. Again, we've heard this before. Article 3, corruption. This focuses on financial conflicts of interest and using the presidency to enrich himself and his family. Familiar territory, but then we get to the spicier ones. Article 4, unlawful creation of offices. This is interesting. They're claiming Trump created federal positions and agencies without proper congressional authorization. This ties directly into that Supreme Court ruling about executive authority. Article 5, more obstruction, but this time specifically about obstructing Congress itself, refusing to comply with subpoenas, blocking witnesses from testifying, the whole 9 yards. Article 6, this is where it gets really dramatic, violation of the Emoluments Clause and foreign influence. They're saying Trump's business dealings, while in office, constitute accepting foreign gifts and payments in violation of the Constitution. And then Article 7, the big one, tyranny. Yeah, they really went there. This article basically argues that Trump's overall pattern of behavior amounts to tyrannical rule that threatens democratic institutions. Now, I know what half of you are thinking. This is just political revenge. Democrats have been trying to impeach Trump since before he even took office the first time. And yeah, there's definitely truth to that. The Democratic base has wanted Trump gone since the beginning. This isn't exactly news. But here's what makes this different: the timing and the context. Because this isn't just Democrats screaming into the void anymore. The Supreme Court ruling gives them actual ammunition. They can point to a concrete decision and say, look, see, this is why we need to act. The courts just gave up on checking presidential power, so we have no choice but to impeach. It's not just Trump they're targeting. The resolution calls for impeachment proceedings against key administration officials too. We're talking about potentially dozens of people. This would be the most sweeping use of impeachment power in American history, like by a lot. Now, let's talk about the political reality here, because that's what this really comes down to. Do Democrats actually think they can remove Trump from office? No. Of course not. They don't have the votes in the Senate. They didn't even have the votes when they impeached him twice during his first term. This isn't about actually removing him. So what's it about? Well, a few things. It's about the midterms. Democrats need their base energized and angry. Nothing energizes the Democratic base quite like impeachment proceedings. Second, it's about creating a record. Every hearing, every piece of testimony, every document they uncover, that all becomes part of the public record. It shapes public opinion even if it doesn't result in removal. Third, and this might be the most important, it's about setting precedent. Because if Democrats can establish that this kind of expansive use of executive power justifies impeachment, even if they don't succeed now, it creates a framework for the future. Next time there's a Democratic House and a Republican president or vice versa, this resolution becomes the template. But here's where it gets really messy. Republicans are absolutely furious about this, and I mean furious. They're calling it a witch hunt, a coup attempt, unconstitutional harassment. Some GOP members are already talking about impeaching the next Democratic president on day one just out of pure retaliation. And you know what? They probably will, because that's where we're at now. Impeachment used to be this rare, serious constitutional remedy reserved for the most egregious presidential misconduct. Now it's just another partisan weapon. Both sides do it. Both sides justify it. And neither side seems to care that they're basically destroying the credibility of the entire process. The American public is exhausted by all of this. Poll after poll shows people are just tired. Tired of investigations, tired of impeachments, tired of constitutional crises every other week. But nobody in Washington seems to care because the political incentives are all wrong. Being reasonable and moderate doesn't win primaries. Being loud and extreme does. And can we just talk about how insane it is that we're even having this conversation? Like, step back for a second and think about what's happening. The Supreme Court says the president has more power. Congress says that's exactly why we need to remove the president, and both sides are claiming they're defending the Constitution while simultaneously undermining faith in our institutions. It's like watching a slow-motion car crash. You can see it coming. You know it's going to be bad. But nobody's hitting the brakes. Everyone's just accelerating toward the collision. Let's break this down into what actually matters here, because we've covered a lot of ground and I want to make sure we're all on the same page about why this is such a big deal. Point 1, presidential power is expanding, and nobody seems able to stop it. This Supreme Court ruling isn't happening in a vacuum. Over the past few decades, regardless of which party controls the White House, presidential power has been growing. Executive orders, emergency declarations, signing statements, presidents keep finding new ways to act without Congress, and the courts have been increasingly reluctant to push back. This latest ruling is just the most recent example of that trend. What does that mean for regular people? Well, it means the person you elect as president matters more than ever because they have more unilateral power than any president in American history. They can do more without needing approval from anyone else. And if you don't like what they're doing, your options for stopping them are getting more and more limited. Think about the implications here. If the president can fire anyone in the executive branch without real oversight, what stops them from purging everyone who disagrees with them? What stops them from installing loyalists in every position of power? The founders created a system of checks and balances specifically to prevent this kind of consolidation of power. But those checks are getting weaker by the day. We're watching the separation of powers erode in real time. And most people don't even realize it's happening because they're too focused on the daily drama and the Twitter fights and whatever scandal is trending this week. Point 2, impeachment is broken, like completely broken. It doesn't work anymore. It's not a real check on presidential power. When it's used as a partisan political tool, when every president faces impeachment threats from the opposing party, when it becomes routine, it loses all meaning. The founders created impeachment as this serious remedy for serious misconduct. Now, it's just another thing that happens when the House and the presidency are controlled by different parties. And both sides are guilty here. Republicans impeach Clinton. Democrats impeach Trump twice. Now they're trying again. And Republicans are already promising revenge. This isn't healthy, this isn't sustainable, but nobody knows how to fix it because the incentives are all wrong. Here's the thing though, even though impeachment doesn't result in removal anymore, it still has power. It still dominates the news cycle. It still forces everyone to pick a side. It still poisons the political atmosphere and makes any kind of cooperation basically impossible. So even though it's broken as a constitutional remedy, it's still incredibly effective as a political weapon. And that's exactly why both parties keep using it. Not because they think it'll work, but because it energizes their base and puts the other side on defense. Point 3, the midterms are going to be absolutely insane. Everything we're talking about right now is going to be the main issue. Democrats are going to run on, we need more seats to check Trump's power and hold him accountable. Republicans are going to run on stop the witch hunt and let the president govern. Every single congressional race is going to be nationalized around this fight. And here's the thing. Normally, midterm elections favor the party that doesn't control the White House. That would be Democrats. But Trump isn't a normal president. And these aren't normal times. His base is incredibly energized. They see all of this as persecution, as proof that the establishment is out to get him. That could drive turnout in ways that defy normal political gravity. On the flip side, there are a lot of moderate voters, independents, people who voted for Trump but aren't part of the hardcore base, who might be getting uncomfortable with all of this. The impeachment charges, the Supreme Court ruling, the expanding executive power. Some of those folks might decide they want Congress to be a check on the president after all. So who wins? Honestly, nobody knows. We're in completely uncharted territory here. The old rules don't apply anymore. The old patterns don't hold. Everything's up for grabs. Point 4, this is about way more than Trump. I know the whole story is framed around Trump because that's what gets clicks and views, but the real issue here is about the structure of American government going forward. Once these precedents are set, once this expansion of presidential power is normalized, it doesn't go away when Trump leaves office. The next president, whoever that is, Democrat or Republican, they're going to have all the same powers, all the same tools, all the same ability to act without meaningful oversight, and they're going to face the same threat of immediate impeachment from the opposition party because that's just what we do now. We're reshaping American democracy in real time, and most people aren't even paying attention because they're so exhausted by the constant drama. That's the scary part. The most significant constitutional changes in generations are happening, and people are tuning out because they can't handle another crisis. The Supreme Court ruling that's driving all of this is actually part of a much larger pattern that's been developing for decades. The expansion of executive power isn't new. It's been happening gradually, almost imperceptibly. with each president claiming a little more authority than the last. But what makes this moment different is the combination of factors coming together all at once. You've got a Supreme Court that's more conservative than it's been in generations, a president who's willing to push the boundaries of executive power further than anyone before him, and a Congress that's so polarized it can barely function, let alone serve as an effective check on presidential authority. The impeachment resolution is ambitious, to say the least. 7 articles is unprecedented. The inclusion of tyranny as an article is particularly striking because it goes beyond specific allegations of misconduct and attacks the very nature of Trump's presidency. It's an argument that the entire enterprise is illegitimate, that the president's conduct has been so fundamentally at odds with democratic principles that he's not just abusing power, but actually undermining the system itself. That's a heavy charge, and it's one that the founders would have understood because they were literally fighting against tyranny when they wrote the Constitution. The response from Republicans has been predictable, but also revealing. They're not just defending Trump, they're attacking the impeachment process itself. They're questioning whether Congress even has the authority to do what Democrats are trying to do. Some are arguing that impeachment is only for criminal conduct, not policy disagreements, which is an interesting argument given that they impeached Clinton for perjury and obstruction, which are crimes, but also pursued impeachment against Clinton for conduct that wasn't criminal. The inconsistency is glaring, but consistency isn't really the point anymore. The point is winning, and whatever argument helps you win is the one you make. The public is watching all of this with a mixture of exhaustion and alarm. Poll after poll shows that Americans are deeply concerned about the state of democracy, but they're also deeply cynical about whether anything can be done about it. Trust in institutions is at historic lows. Trust in Congress is basically non-existent. Trust in the Supreme Court has been eroding for years, and trust in the presidency depends entirely on which party you belong to. This is the environment in which this constitutional battle is unfolding, an environment where nobody trusts anybody and everybody assumes the worst about everybody else. The legal arguments on both sides are actually more complicated than the political coverage suggests. The Supreme Court ruling, while clearly a victory for Trump's team, isn't as sweeping as some of the critics are claiming. The decision was relatively narrow in its actual holding. It dealt with specific personnel issues rather than general executive authority. But the dissenting opinion raised the specter of broader applications, and that's what's driving the panic. The fear is that this ruling will be used as a precedent to justify all sorts of executive overreach that the court might not have intended. Similarly, the impeachment resolution includes some articles that are stronger than others. The obstruction and abuse of power charges have the most direct evidence behind them. The tyranny charge is more of an overall assessment than a specific allegation, and it's the one that's most likely to be attacked as overly political. But the very fact that tyranny is being used in an impeachment resolution at all is a sign of how far things have escalated. This isn't the language of ordinary political disagreement. This is the language of constitutional crisis. What happens next depends on a lot of factors. The House will hold hearings. The hearings will produce dramatic moments that will be replayed endlessly on cable news. The public will be exposed to reams of evidence and argument, and then the House will vote. If the vote goes the way it looks like it will, the articles will pass and go to the Senate. In the Senate, a trial will happen, probably quickly, and then a vote. The vote will almost certainly acquit Trump, just as it did before. And then the whole process will start over again with the next perceived outrage. But the damage will already be done. The precedent will be set that impeachment is a routine political tool. The Supreme Court ruling will remain in place. Presidential power will be expanded. And the American people will be even more exhausted and cynical than they already are. This is the cycle we're stuck in. Each crisis makes the next one easier to imagine. Each breach of norms makes the next breach less shocking. Each expansion of power makes the next expansion less noticeable. Until eventually, the system that was designed to prevent tyranny becomes the vehicle for it. The Supreme Court ruling and the impeachment resolution are both symptoms of the same underlying problem. The system isn't working the way it was designed to. The checks and balances are failing. The institutions are weak. The norms are broken. And nobody seems to know how to fix it. The founders had a vision of a government that would be strong enough to govern, but limited enough to prevent tyranny. They built in mechanisms to keep power in check. But those mechanisms require people of good faith to operate them. They require a shared commitment to the system itself. And that shared commitment is precisely what we've lost. So where does this leave us? We're in uncharted territory. The old rules don't apply, the old assumptions don't hold, the old institutions are struggling to adapt, and the American people are caught in the middle, trying to make sense of a political system that seems to have lost its mind. The midterms will be a referendum on all of this. They'll decide whether the impeachment process continues or whether it gets abandoned. They'll decide whether the Supreme Court's ruling gets reinforced or challenged. They'll decide which vision of America prevails. But the midterms won't solve the underlying problem. The underlying problem is that our constitutional system is showing its age. It was designed for a different era, for a different kind of politics, for a different kind of country. And it's struggling to adapt to the realities of modern American life. The expansion of executive power is a feature of this struggle. The politicization of impeachment is a feature of this struggle. The erosion of trust in institutions is a feature of this struggle. And until we figure out how to address the root causes, the symptoms will keep getting worse. The Supreme Court ruling is a reminder that institutions aren't neutral. They have biases, they have ideologies, they have trajectories, and the trajectory of the court has been toward expanding executive power for decades. The impeachment resolution is a reminder that institutions can fight back. Congress isn't powerless. It has tools, even if those tools are blunt instruments, and it's willing to use them, even if using them further damages the institution. This is the paradox of our moment. The very actions we take to defend democracy end up undermining it. The very tools we use to protect the system end up weakening it. And we keep using them anyway because the alternative is even worse. The constitutional battle that's unfolding right now will be studied by historians for generations. Assuming there are still historians and assuming there's still a country to study, it will be seen as a turning point one way or the other. Either it will be the moment when the system held, when the checks and balances worked, when democracy survived, or it will be the moment when the system broke, when the checks and balances failed, when democracy gave way to something else. We don't know which outcome we're heading toward. We don't know how this ends. We don't even know if we're asking the right questions. What we do know is that this is happening right now, in real time, in front of our eyes. The Supreme Court ruling is real. The impeachment resolution is real. The constitutional battle is real. And the outcome will affect every single American, not just politically, but fundamentally. The nature of American government is being contested and reshaped. The balance of power is shifting. The future of democracy is in play, and we're all just trying to keep up. This is the world we live in now. Constitutional crises are just another Tuesday. Impeachment is just another political tactic. The Supreme Court is just another partisan battlefield. Nothing means anything anymore, or maybe everything means too much. Hard to tell at this point. The 2026 midterms are going to be absolutely insane. The attack ads are going to be nuclear. The rhetoric is going to be off the charts. Every race is going to be presented as life or death for democracy according to both sides. It's going to be exhausting. It's going to be expensive. And it's probably going to solve exactly nothing. But we'll be here to cover every insane moment of it. Because if there's one thing you can count on, it's that things are going to keep getting weirder. The Supreme Court ruling and the impeachment resolution are just the latest chapters in a story that's been building for years. And the story is far from over. The next chapters are being written right now, in courtrooms, in hearing rooms, in campaign offices, and in the minds of voters. We're all living through history, whether we realize it or not, and history has a way of surprising us.